And to get started with the first step, with the connection to our source files, we should have another look at the Power BI Desktop workflow though, because in this module, we'll entirely focus on the data preparation. This means onto the work in the query editor. So as I mentioned it already, the goal of this module is to have a prepared data set, which can then be loaded into the data model, where we'll continue in the next module. And before we dive right into the course project, one note at this stage: the term query editor stems from the fact that we are working with queries in this query editor. You can imagine this as follows. Power BI Desktop is our tool, and we want to connect it to our source data. To do so, Power BI Desktop uses so-called connectors. That's the internal functionality, you could say, to establish the connection between Power BI Desktop and the source files. And when Power BI Desktop then retrieves the data from the source files and loads this information into Power BI Desktop, well, this is performed via so-called queries. So we query data. That's why it's called Query Editor. But that's enough of the theory now. Let's go back to the course project and let's see how we can now connect Power BI Desktop to our source files and how we can perform our queries. I'm back in the empty project file that we prepared in the last lecture of the last module. Make sure to download this file and open it in case you haven't done that so far. I just renamed the file to this new naming here. You don't have to do that though. Now we want to connect Power BI Desktop to our source files. And to do that, we could either go to get data right here, then establish the connection, and then decide if we want to load the data into the data model or if we want to access the query editor. That's the navigator part you might remember from the first module. That's a valid option, but as we want to stay in the query editor, I will now first access the query editor and then establish the connection to the source files. And to do that, we learned it already, we can click onto this button here. Now the query editor opened and we can maximize it. And to connect it to the source files, we need source files first, because this is the start of our course project. Therefore, attached to this lecture, you can find a zip file, which you should download now. It's this source files zip here. Then open this file and now make sure to unzip this source folder here. Inside the source folder, you can now find three files, three CSV files. And if you, for example, right-click onto the third one and go to Open with Notepad, you can see that the file contains population data, so male, female, and total population data, for different countries, here the location, periods, so time for different years, and age groups. So this is the information we want to work with, population data. And if you close this file, you can see that each file contains this information for different periods. So in total, we have the data from 1950 up to 2100. So make sure to remember the location of this source folder here. And now we can go back to Power BI Desktop, into the query editor. And now we go to New Source. We click it in the upper part here. And in New Source, we now select the second option, Text CSV, because as you saw, we are working with CSV files here, and now press Connect. Navigate to the path where you stored the source folder we just downloaded. In my case, this is right here. And then open this folder and select the first file, the 1950 file. Now press Open. And now we get a preview of the data that we want to connect Power BI Desktop to now. You can specify two things here actually. The first thing here is the delimiter. The delimiter is responsible to tell Power BI Desktop how the different columns here, so column 1, column 2, and column 3 are separated. And if you go back to the source data we just had a look at, go to the source folder and maybe now open this 1950 file, open with Notepad, you see that our delimiter here is the comma, this one and that one. So that's the separator for the individual columns. Therefore, comma is the right setting here. So we can stick to this. You can change the delimiter for your own projects here and even create custom delimiters if you want to. And then we have this data type detection logic. As you remembered in the options, we unselected automatic type detection. Therefore, this feature is not relevant here at the moment. But if you would use this feature that allows Power BI Desktop to automatically identify which data types, so for example numbers or text, is stored in the columns, then you can specify the amount of rows here, which should be used to perform this automatic type detection. For us, it doesn't play a role, therefore we can stick to the default data. We see we have some issues here immediately, but generally the data looks fine, so let's press OK now. And with that, the connection to the first source file was established. As you can see in the left part, we have now our first query as shown in the interface module, and in the right part in the applied steps, we only have this first step, so establishing the connection to the source file. If you think back about the initial course project, we had some initial steps applied here by default from Power BI. This was due to the automatic identification steps that we didn't unselect there. In our case, we now have this source step, and if you click onto this gear wheel symbol, you can see that the data source settings menu opened. You remember this maybe from the last module when we showed you how to work with the attached project files. So as you can see already, these applied steps are very important as they allow you to dive into the step and change it. For the moment, we are of course totally fine right here, therefore we can press OK, and we can now connect Power BI Desktop to our second file. So this time we can use the quicker access, so let's open the most common data sources and select text CSV right here. We now select the second file, so the 2001, press open, and again we get the same preview, which is okay. Again, we see some issues here we have to work on throughout this module, but we can press OK. And with that, we establish the connection to the second query now. Again, we have the query here and the connection to the source file here in the applied steps. So let's now go to new source once again, text CSV, and now select the 2050 file, press open here. And now that the preview loaded, we can again press OK. And finally, we establish the connection to all our three initial source files. However, if you look closer at the different files, I see lots of issues here, starting from the column name here in the third query. But let's now go back to this first query, the 1950 query, and let's now explore what's wrong here in this and the other queries in the next lecture.